Okay, so the recording's for Alex over here and anybody else that wants to see. So we're doing the Sikha number 2 for this week's portion, Vayakhel, and it's called The Fire of Gehinnom Has No Power. Gehinnom is the word for hell in Hebrew. Okay, so chapter 1, who wants to read chapter 1?
I do.
Okay, we got Joey over here.
Ark and Mishkan. On the verse that thou made Ark, the Midrash comments. When Hashem told Moshe the Mishkan, Moshe went and told
Bezalel, he was the architect and builder of the whole Mishkan.
Oh.
He was the head person. There are a lot of people working, but he was the head person in charge of the whole construction of the Mishkan. And the Medrash tells us he was
the Albert Khan.
He was
the Marty Abel.
How old was he when he did it?
13. How long was
13.
Thank you, Leah.
Very good, very good.
Right.
Leah. Okay.
That was Leah, not me.
In the shadow of God.
The shade
Wow.
of God, yeah.
Man, so much information. But tell us, what is the purpose of this Mishkan? Moshe said, so that the Holy One will cause the Shekhinah to rest in it and teach Torah to Israel. But Zella asked, but where will the Torah be placed? Moshe answered, after we have made the Mishkan, we will make the ark. But Zella responded, our teacher, Moshe, this is not fitting for the honor of the Torah. Let us make the ark first, and then we will build the Mishkan. Therefore, Batzalel merited to have the ark ascribed to him, as the verse says, Batzalel made the ark.
So not only was he the construction of the whole Mishkan, he challenged Moshe for the order of how to build it, and he was right. You got
old kid.
Got to agree to him, yeah.
Okay.
That is bar mitzvah, man.
That's right. The Midrash implies that the purpose of the ark was for something other than enabling the indwelling of the Shekhinah in the Mishkan. This is seemingly implied also by a different Midrash, which states that following the building of the Mishkan, Hashem said, you have established an abode for me. Now establish an abode for the Torah, so that it will dwell with me.
In other words, from the fact that Bezalel said to make the ark first before the Mishkan, that means we need to have an ark even before we have a Mishkan. Even before we have God, a place for God to dwell, we need to have a place to put the Torah. So that means the ark wasn't specifically for God, a part of the Mishkan for God to dwell. It was something more specific that had to be done first.
So what did they do with the broken tablets all this time?
So
carrying them in a garbage bag?
So the broken in the beginning until the temple was built in Jerusalem, there was 2 arks. There was one ark for the broken tablets and one ark for the complete tablets,
but not the ark for the Mishkan. Different ark.
So right. So the ark for that was in the Mishkan, and that one had the complete tablets and the Torah scroll that Moshe wrote. The broken tablets were in a separate ark. When they built the temple in Jerusalem, then it was all inside that same ark.
Got it.
Okay. Oh, hi Jeff.
Hi Jeff. Heck? No, not in the airport. Don't say that. This is difficult to understand. I think it's still true. The Torah was placed in the ark, but the primary resting and indwelling of the Shekhinah was also in and through the ark. As Rambam explains, the main purpose of the Mishkan was to serve as a place where the Shekhinah would rest, which is the ark. How then can we differentiate between them, asserting that the Mishkan and the Mikdash were overall for the sake of the indwelling of the Shekhinah, whereas the ark served as an abode for the Torah?
Okay, so the question is that what's the purpose of the ark? The ark that held the tablets in the Mishkan, in the sanctuary. So it seems to imply from this midrash that we just quoted that the purpose of the ark was specifically for the Torah, as opposed to the general purpose of the whole Mishkan, which was a place for God to dwell. And our question is, why are we making that differentiation? You know, a place for God to dwell and a place for the Torah. It's all the same thing. It's all in the ark. That's the purpose of that's all part of the ark. So why are we making this differentiation and saying it's two different things? Okay, chapter 2. Who wants to read chapter 2?
I will. Teachings of Reish Lakish and Rabbi Eliezer. We will clarify this matter prefacing the indwelling of the Shekhinah in the Mishkan, which is called a Mikdash, is mentioned in the verse, "They shall make me a Mikdash sanctuary, and I will dwell with them within them." From its nuanced wording, the Torah does not say in it, but rather within them. We learn that the sanctuary possesses another facet, namely, I will dwell within every single person.
So this is one of the big concepts that are explained in Hasidus, that every single person we have to make in ourself a temple, a home for God within ourselves, in our hearts. And that we learn from the verse, from the plural form, it says, I will dwell in them, even though God only has one temple, them refers to every person.
The explanation regarding the indwelling of Shekhinah within, in the private sanctuary of every person, is as follows. At the end of Tractate Chagiga, the Gemara says, Rabbi Abahu said that Rabbi Elazar said, the flames of Gehenna have no power over Torah scholars. This can be derived by a Kal Vachomer from a salamander.
So a Kal Vachomer is one of the methods of deduction in the Talmud. It's a method of deriving a logical proof that if this is the case by one thing, how much more so would this be the case by something else, which is even stronger than the first thing. Anyways, that's what the Kal Vachomer is. So now we're going to see one from the salamander. What?
Well, that's a great word.
Okay. Salamanders are produced by fire. And so when a person smears himself with its blood, fire has no power over him. How much more so then should fire not have any power over Torah scholars, whose entire bodies are fire, as it says, surely my words are as fire, says Hashem. Reish Lakish said, the flames
so you see the Kal Vachomer. If a salamander doesn't have any
Fire
that it was just
Who is salamander?
salamander is a
It's a
type
little
of lizard, but it's not an actual lizard. It's considered a amphibian as
I had
opposed
one
to
when I was a kid.
a reptile. So it's a different. It looks similar to a lizard, but it's a little bit different. And
Small.
and according to the tradition in the Talmud, they were created from fire, and they would be seen coming out of fireplaces. What was that? Oh, on the boat.
We're on the boat.
The Noah.
yeah, they were there.
Yeah, they were there.
The ark.
They were in the ark.
So
So if the salamander, the fire doesn't have any power over it, all the more so Torah scholars whose entire bodies are considered like fire, then all the more so the fire doesn't have any power over Torah scholars. And which Torah scholar, which fire? We're talking about the fire of Gehenna, of hell, which isn't we're not talking about a physical fire, and we're not talking about the hell that you are accustomed to thinking about. We believe in heaven and hell, but not the same heaven and hell that's in the movies.
Yeah, I didn't know that for a while.
So, but there is
This
this concept of a fire of hell, of Gehenna, and it has no control over a Torah scholar, which is what we just learned from the Kal Vachomer from the salamander. Okay.
Reish Lakish said, the flames of Gehenna have no power over the sinners of Israel. This can be derived by a Kal Vachomer from the golden altar. The golden altar was plated with gold no thicker than a gold dinar, and which had incense burning on it. where'd it go? Burning on it for many years. Nevertheless, fire had no power over it. How much more so should the fire of Gehenna have no power over the sinners of Israel, who are filled with mitzvos as a pomegranate is full of seeds? As it says, Rekatek, your temples are like a slice of pomegranate. Do not read this word as Rekatek, but as Canaan, Shebach, the empty people among you.
Okay, so we have a verse to bring out that even sinners of Israel are filled with pomegranate, are filled with mitzvahs like a pomegranate is filled with seeds. Therefore, we have a kavachomer from the golden altar. And just like the golden altar, which is only plated with gold, and the fire of the incense that was burning on it was able to continue burning on it for many years, it didn't affect the gold plating of the altar. So all the more so sinners of Israel who are full with mitzvahs, not just the plating, then for sure the fire of Gehinnom, the fire of hell, doesn't have any power over them. So we have back-to-back teachings about the fire of Gehinnom, one about Torah scholars and one about sinners. Both of them, the fire of hell doesn't have power over. Okay.
However, on this basis, we need to clarify.
Simply.
No,
Oh, I'm
simply
sorry.
understood.
Sorry. Simply understood, the connection between these two teachings is to be understood as follows. These teachings are a thematic continuation of the previous topic in the Gemara, discussing the plating of the altars, the gold and copper altars.
In the previous week, we had that whole thing with the gold and the copper altars.
Right.
That was the same part at the end of the Tractate Chagiga.
Reish Lakish's teaching, the flames of Gehenna have no power over the sinners of Israel. This can be derived by a Kal V'chomer from the golden altar. Continues this theme since Reish Lakish emphasizes how the altar was plated with gold. Similar to this teaching, the Gemara first presented the teaching of Rabbi Abahu that the flames of Gehenna have no power over Torah scholars.
Okay, so if you just want to understand how this fits in with the Gemara over there, the Gemara is talking about the gold and copper altars and the effects of the purity and impurity, as we went the other week, whether or not to be able to become impure because of the plating that was on it. So in continuation with that whole discussion, it brings a teaching, more of a agadic teaching, which isn't about law, but it's more of a spiritual nature. But it's based on the same idea of the golden plating of the golden altar, and we learn over there that the sinners of Israel don't. The fire of Gehenna doesn't have power over. Before that, once we're talking about the fire of Gehenna, we bring a similar teaching about Torah scholars also, even though it has nothing to do with the topic of the copper and golden plating. So that's how it fits in over here. You know, sometimes the Talmud digresses, it brings in one teaching that's connected, and once we have that one teaching that's connected, it digresses to other teachings that are on the same, are thematically similar. Okay.
However, on this basis, we need to clarify. Reish Lakish's teaching, this can be derived by a Kal V'chomer from the golden altar, should have come first. Only after this teaching should the Gemara have presented Rabbi Abahu's teaching about the Torah scholars, as Rabbi Abahu's teaching does not share a common theme with the topic in the Gemara.
Right. So the Talmud will go on tangents, will digress, but once it brings a teaching that is connected, then it will go and digress and bring more teachings that are connected to that first teaching, even though it's not connected to the original conversation. But over here, that's not what it's doing. Here, it first brings the teaching of the Torah scholars, which has nothing to do with the altars at all. And only then brings the teaching of the altar, teaching us about the sinners of Israel. You know, so it would have made sense to switch around the order, then it wouldn't make sense the order. But we have to understand why it's saying the sinners of Israel, Kal V'chomer, first, before telling, the Torah scholars first before the sinners. So that's one question.
Okay.
B.
The main discussion about the lack of power of Gehenna over the sinners of Israel and about Gehenna in general is found in Tractate Eruvin. There, the Gemara also quotes the teaching of Reish Lakish. The flames of Gehenna have no power over the sinners of Israel. As such, the Gemara there should have also quoted the teaching of Rabbi Abahu. The flames of Gehenna have no power over Torah scholars, since A, the main discussion about this topic is in Eruvin, whereas here in Chagiga, it is only mentioned parenthetically, and B, Eruvin precedes Chagiga in the Talmud.
So we have two questions. Oh, there's a third question now.
See,
Reish Lakish says, this can be derived by Vayakhel from the golden altar, which was plated with gold no thicker than a gold dinar. Nevertheless, fire had no power over it. Seemingly, his point emphasizes the opposite of the point made in the Gemara's earlier conclusion. The rabbis maintain that the plating of the altars is considered subordinate to the altars, meaning the plating on the copper and golden altars were subordinate to the altars. For this reason, the altars were not susceptible to impurity. But Reish Lakish's teaching emphasizes the robustness of the golden altar's plating, the opposite of subordination. That is, the plating, due to its toughness, could tolerate the heat and protected the utensil, the altar, to the extent that fire had no power over it.
Okay, so it's another point that the point that he's emphasizing is the opposite of what the earlier discussion is. So we have 3 points about this Talmudic teachings, about the order in which they're teachings, about the placement, where in the Talmud we're teaching them, and about how the context fits with the previous conversation. So just to recap the 3 questions. So we have 2 teachings about the fire of Gehenna. For one, first we bring a teaching that the fire has no power over Torah scholars, and then we bring a teaching that fire has no power over sinners. And how we derive these 2 teachings, the first teaching, we derive it from a salamander. That's the Kavachomer from the salamander. The second teaching we derive from the plating of the golden altar. Okay, that it's so thick and the fire didn't affect the altar. So our questions are, number 1, the order. The second teaching is the one that makes sense to follow to the previous conversation, the discussion of the Talmud. This discussion of the Talmud was about the plating, and about whether or not it makes the altars impure or not. So then bring the sinners of Israel, which we derive from the plating of the golden altar. Once you bring that, then you can bring other things that the fire of Gehenna doesn't have effect also on Torah scholars too. So it would have made sense if it was the other way around. So that's the first question. Why are we first putting the teaching of scholars of Israel before the sinners? The second question is, it's out of place over here. Because the main place where this whole conversation about Gehenna is in a different tractate in the Talmud. And over there, the main place, it doesn't even bring this teaching of the Torah scholars. So how come over here, where we're just bringing a parenthetical thing, here it brings 2 teachings. But the second teaching about the Torah scholars, it doesn't even bring in the main place. That's another question. And then the third question was about the point of how we derive about this, the sinners of Israel, the fire doesn't have control, we derive from the golden plating of the altar, is the opposite theme of the previous discussion. The previous discussion was showing how the plating was subordinate to the altar. And therefore, since it's only a plating, it's still not susceptible to impurity. Yet, Reish Lakish's teaching about the sinners of Israel and the fire of Gehenna is bringing out how strong the plating is. It's so thick, it protects the altar from the fire. The fire has no control over it. So it's the exact opposite point that we're bringing out than what we were discussing previously. Yes?
I think that it is the opposite, that like we cannot think that it is subordinate if it is so thick, but it can be still subordinate because it's the altar is big And even it's sick, but it is
Right. In other words, both things could be true,
right.
but we're bringing out an opposite point. In other words, before we're emphasizing how it's not something special, it's subordinate, it's nothing.
Mm.
And now we're bringing out, no, it is something big and thick and powerful and it's protecting.
Mm.
So it's true that it could be both at the same time, but we're emphasizing an opposite idea.
Okay.
So we're coming in continuation. Now that we mentioned how nothing the plating is, now let's bring a teaching about it. And that teaching tells us how powerful it is. So, okay. So before we get to the answers, we're gonna have some more. Oh, you know what? There's just a couple more questions. So we just do the couple more questions, and we'll leave the answers for tomorrow.
I got no carpool today.
Okay. So let's do chapter 3. Chapter 3 is a couple more questions.
Maybe Moishe wants.
Moishe, you want to read?
Yeah. You ready? Chapter 3?
Yeah.
You hear me? More questions on the Talmudic expositions. We need to clarify many further nuances in this teaching of the Gemara. Among them, A, the Kal Vachomer from the golden altar that the Gemara applies to the sinners of Israel surely holds true, even in an even greater measure with respect to Torah scholars. Meaning, just as the gold plating preventing the fire from damaging the altar, so too a Torah scholar's Torah learning prevents the flames of Gehinnom from harming him. This should apply even if the Torah scholar performed unseemly deeds, which would make him deserving of punishment by the flames of Gehinnom, if not for the merit of his Torah learning. As such, it is unclear, A, the entire teaching about Torah scholars is seemingly superfluous, for we could have reached this conclusion on our own.
Superfluous is unnecessary, extra.
Right. If this concept and teaching applies to the sinners of Israel, how much more so should it apply to Torah scholars?
So we
And
didn't have to bring that whole teaching. We would have understood that if the sinners of Israel, the fire doesn't have a problem. So then for sure Torah scholars,
Right.
the same reasoning that saves the sinners of Israel, for sure will save the Torah scholars.
And B, now that in fact the Gemara does present the special insight about Torah scholars, why does it need to come up with a different Kal V'chomer? The Gemara should have used the same Kal V'chomer from the altar.
So even if you need to have a separate learning specifically about Torah scholars, but you could still use the same Kal V'chomer, the same method of deduction. That if the plating of the altar was able to protect the altar from the fire, for sure the mitzvahs or the Torah scholars will protect them from the fire. Why do we have to bring the whole salamander?
This question is even stronger. The salamander was an impure sheretz, or at least a chaya.
A
Why
sheretz
would
is
we-
a name for creepy crawly animals that are not kosher to eat. A chaya is the name of a beast. It's a category of animals that are considered wild animals.
His first name is Vilda.
There you go.
That's one of the few Yiddish words most of us knew from growing up.
Or most of us were.
The chaya.
Because our mothers called us that. That's why.
Thought that was my name.
This question is even stronger. The salamander was an impure sheretz, or at least a chaya. Why would we derive a lesson about Torah scholars from a sheretz when we can infer the same lesson from the golden altar of the Beis Hamikdash?
So if we have two choices of what to learn from, let's learn from the golden altar in the temple instead of from an impure animal.
Mhm.
So B,
Salamandra, we cannot eat. I got
No,
it.
no eating salamander. Sorry.
so true, the flames of Gehinnom have no power over them, the Torah scholars, because they are Torah scholars, and the sinners of Israel, because they are filled with mitzvahs. But since both Torah scholars and the sinners of Israel wind up in Gehinnom as a result of their sins, why then do we refer to the first group only with the epithet Torah scholars, and the second only with the epithet sinners of Israel?
In other words, the Torah scholars in this context are also sinners of Israel, because that's why they're in Gehenna in the first place. They sinned. So why are we categorizing them as just Torah scholars? If everything's good about them, whereas the sinners, we just call them sinners. Oh, they're like totally sinners. That's what they are. And these guys, even though they also sinned, we're not calling them sinners. So the description about these two groups, you have to understand. So we got two questions over here. First of all, about the Kal V'chomers and why we even need a second Kal V'chomer, and even if we do, why are we learning it from a different method? We can learn it from the same golden altar. Furthermore, it's much better to learn from golden altar, which is a holy thing, as opposed to an impure animal, a salamander. That's all the first question. And the second question, and why are we calling the groups by these names? Torah scholars and sinners of Israel, were both of them landed in Gehenna because they sinned. So, well, okay, so that's our questions of the Talmud. So now in chapter 4, we'll start the explanation. Okay.
Isn't the Homer, Rabbi, a donkey or the beast, a beast?
That's a chamor. Same
Chamor.
orders.
Okay.
Different order.
That was your cousin's family.
The literal translation of Kal V'chomer, Kal means light, and Chomer means heavy or stringent. And the idea is that if this lesson applies to the light object, all the more so will it apply to the heavier object.
Okay.
So if a child can pick this up, then for sure you could pick this up because you're stronger than a child. You're the Chomer, and the child would be the Kal. So that's the method of deduction over here. What
I
was that,
wanted to
Larissa?
ask this question and you answered before I asked.
There you go. Okay, we're gonna stop the recording.
Thank you, Rabbi.